This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Beginning today's show is Dennis McKinney, Director of the Kansas Farm Service Agency, to discuss the expansion of the Emergency Livestock Assistance Program, as well as the status of other FSA programs. K-State Wheat Production Specialist Romulo Lollato keeps the show rolling as he explains the current condition of the wheat crop and addresses the freeze damage concern for wheat growers. The show winds up with K-State's Brad White, Katie Long, and Brian Lubbers with another segment from the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast as they talk about a literature review on combination therapy. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show with some information from the Farm Service Agency. And today we're joined by Director of the Kansas Farm Service Agency, Dennis McKinney. Dennis, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Dennis, talking about a few different programs taking place right now. And first, talking about an extension on the Emergency Livestock Assistance Program.
Yes, we're looking at trying to figure a new way to handle that program because we have a lot of producers who now will have forage left standing for winter grazing, whether it's a grass or Sudan grass or forage sorghum. It's a growing in popularity. It's a low-cost way to store up forage for winter consumption. We have producers doing that, and they're feeding very little hay in the winter, not much protein supplement. They've combined that with delayed calving and other practices to reduce their costs. The problem was our ELAP program. In government, we like our acronyms. ELAP, Emergency Livestock Assistance Program, really did not recognize that when they were subject to natural disaster like a fire, and they lost that forage. So we didn't complement that. It kind of, in a way, penalized them for employing a new and good practice. And that practice is also good for the environment. It's good for wildlife habitat, helps increase water infiltration, variety of things it's good for, but it's also a good practice for the farmers. So what the department's getting ready to do, they're going to let us extend that ELAP program now to forage left standing for winter grazing. We will extend that back to fires that occurred in the last part of 2021. So the 4-county fire that occurred December 15th of 2021 would be covered. That's where we had the most significant losses we've had in several years. So producers that lost that forage left standing were not compensated for it can apply at their county office. We'll need a few days yet to work out the processes with our county offices, and then they'll be contacting you, or you can call the county office, of course. But it'll take us a few days to get all those processes worked out, and we'll get that implemented. But I think it's a good step forward. Good programs should reward good practices, and that's what this is. It's a new practice and designed to increase profitability, but it also has several environmental benefits. So let's don't penalize producers. A lot of what we do is we help mitigate risk. If they're doing something really good like that, we should help mitigate the risk just like we do all of the producers using more traditional practices.
Is there a date at which producers would need to get this all taken care of for this extension on ELAP?
I would check if you haven't heard from us, check with your county office next week. As again, it's primarily going to be north central Kansas, up there at Ellis, Trego, in that area, Russell counties in there. That'd be the primary where we have the most producers affected, but there may be other producers who were affected in the last 3 months of 2021 by fires, and they'll be eligible. But check with your county office. We have good people out there, and they'll get you up to speed on it.
Mentioning something now that we've talked quite a bit about in the past, CRP. However, general CRP registration is officially closed.
That's correct. Of course, sometimes we'll run a general CRP sign up in the fall. That has happened before, later in the summer. But for this spring, it is closed. I would mention one thing about it. Our rotability index was changed last year. So it was changed so that some of our fields in far southwestern Kansas and western Kansas were saying, hey, it's not eligible, it's not erodible enough. Well, we knew that's not correct. This year, if some of those fields come up, says they're not erodible enough, we're sending them on in any way for extra evaluation. So there's some problems there with that erodibility index, but we're overcoming that. General CRPA signups closed for now. Continuous signups still going on through July 31st. That would include those enrolling for in continuous CRP. That would include those enrolling in the Upland Game CRP or the lesser prairie chicken CRP programs. Those contracts, instead of 10 years, typically will run 15 years. The longer-term contract, a few more restrictions on grazing, but a better payment rate and longer-term contract. We do hope to get another sign-up this spring sometime for the migratory waterfowl CRP, which I call Playa Lake CRP, which is primarily in far western Kansas, focuses on restoring the playas, has a much higher payment rate, focuses on the playas, which I think probably gives us the biggest bang for the buck in CRP programs. A lot of return there, not only to improve the habitat, but we also, research tells us, increase groundwater infiltration and groundwater recharge. So we hope to get that again this spring. We do anticipate a grassland CRP sign-up probably starting at the end of April, running through May. That's been a very popular program these last 2 years, is grassland CRP sign-up. We've probably picked up over 1 million acres of that in Kansas. Well, not 1 million, but several 100,000 acres in Kansas, getting us back up over 2 million acres total CRP in Kansas.
Another program for us to mention, Dennis, the Dairy Margin Coverage Program, and the deadline for it comes up this month.
Yeah, April 29th is the deadline for dairy margin coverage to apply for that program. And again, for the smaller producers who produce less than 5 million pounds of milk per year, they can adjust their production history to improve their payment under that program. Also, our marketing assistance loans can still be made on corn and milo and soybeans through May 31st. If you don't want to sell them yet, you want to get a marketing assistance loan, interest rate 6%.
And Dennis, you mentioned wanting to support the farmers, and one way you guys do that at the Farm Service Agency is farm loan programs.
Yes, our farm loan program that we administer. Some of our old-timers remember the Farmers Home Administration back 1994. That was incorporated into the Farm Service Agency. We still do that. We're up over $1 billion in loan volume statewide in Kansas. Lately, like last year and the year before, we had a lot of farm ownership loans coming in, people applying to buy farmland, particularly younger producers. That's dropped off some. What we're seeing is a big increase in restructurings and people trying to refinance because we have a lot of the state that hasn't had much of a wheat crop for 2 years. Fall crops were limited, didn't raise a lot of grass. So this is where we really kick in to try to help producers survive these tough times. We're also getting a lot of applications for our guaranteed loans from banks. Banks are continuing to carry some of these producers, but they'd like some added security, so they're having them come in to see us for the guaranteed loans. I would add, if you're interested, you think you're eligible, check with your local Farm Service Agency office. They'll send you to the correct loan office that we have. We have about 20 of those loan offices around the state. If you in an area that's impacted by drought, those emergency loans are 3.75% interest right now. Our direct operating loans are about 5.125% interest. The farm ownership loans are 5.375% interest. So it's pretty good interest rates out there. We try to structure them, especially for beginning farmers, to get them where they won't use up all your cash flow in those first several years, and help you get started and generate the cash flow you need to run your business. I would also mention those joint financing 50-50 loans where we loan for half, we make a loan for half the land purchased, and the bank would make a loan for the other half. Those right now are at 3.375% interest. So it's a good rate. Check us out. If you think we can help you get into farming and stay there, if you're eligible, check with us. We've got some good opportunities there. And we really like partnering. If we can partner with you and your commercial banker to make good things happen, we'd like to do that too.
And always wanting to mention the great place where people can go and find out more information about these programs, but also all the other programs FSA has to offer.
Yeah, we have 96 service centers around the state of Kansas. Check with any one of them. They can get you to the right place. We have some people come in, still do a lot of the work directly. We have more and more younger producers, of course, that do the work remotely and work over the internet. We try to accommodate either one. We have 96 service centers in Kansas. We have over 20 loan offices around the state. We also offer farm storage facility loans, which do not have an income restriction on them. If you're interested in improving your farm storage facilities, take a look at what we do. A lot of producers work with us and their banks on that. We have a variety of programs that try to help producers mitigate risk and stay in business and handle both market risk as well as weather risk. We have a lot of that in agriculture, so that's why we were created to begin with. We like doing what we do. Like I say, as I usually say, we have the privilege of partnering with the world's best farmers and ranchers. We help improve the environment, and we also help our nation have the safest, most abundant food supply in the world. If you look at all the national security issues our nation faces right now, I think there's no better tool for strong national security, and that's a safe and abundant food supply.
Dennis, as always, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you.
That was Director of the Kansas Farm Service Agency, Dennis McKinney. As always, you can learn more by going to your local FSA Service Center or by going online to Farmers.gov. Again, that is Farmers.gov. Before we cut to a break, we're now going to be joined by USDA's Rod Bain and Secretary Pete Buttigieg as he explains some ways to circumvent potential disruptions to ag production supply chains at the Port of Baltimore.
With cargo shipping into the Port of Baltimore now hampered by a bridge collapse, what can be done to mitigate potential supply chain disruptions to farm tractors and equipment and other ag imports and exports? Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg says one potential strategy in play is diversion of cargo ships to other East Coast ports.
It is an important port and an important system of the East Coast ports. Now, a lot of the goods that come on or off there go as part of runs where ships also visit the ports of New York and New Jersey and Virginia. And so right now, I think there are already diversions taking place to those and other East Coast ports, helping to absorb some of that need.
In addition, light-duty vehicle finishing at the Port of Baltimore can be diverted to similar East Coast port facilities. Yet Secretary Buttigieg acknowledges that it's more complicated to divert such work on tractor and other farm equipment. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Once again, that was U.S. Department of Agriculture's Rod Bain, and he was joined by Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg as they were discussing the potential disruptions to ag product supply chains at the Port of Baltimore. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, and if you aren't going to be able to join us once we come back from that break, just want to remind you that you can always find this full show and previous shows by going online to agtoday.net. We're cutting to that short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about the current state of the wheat crop. And then to talk about it, we're joined by K-State Wheat Production Specialist Romulo Lollato. Romulo, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Shelby. Great to be here today.
Before we talk about what the wheat crop currently looks like, first taking a look back to see how we got here.
Yeah, I always like to give a brief overview of how the season has been so far, just to kind of get everybody on the same page on how the crop looks like, especially for those folks that are perhaps outside of the state and still interested in these, right? But essentially, the 2023-24 wheat crop was off to actually a pretty good start last fall. There were some timely precipitation events that came by mid-September towards the western part of the state and kind of towards October in the central part of the state. And those led to a pretty good emergence kind of overall. Now, there are exceptions to that, in particular, one region around Hayes, north and west from that part of the central part of the state, going a little bit to north and west. There was essentially a drought spell where they were missing some of those September and October rainfalls around there. So much so that if you look at a map of the greenness in the state today compared to historical, you can see that spot where the crop just didn't emerge on time. And it wasn't until sometime in December or even January when there was some precipitation there in form of snow, and then the crop just kind of coming up in the spring. And so with that exception of that spot, which is a fairly large spot, but that spot going from Hayes north and west a bit, the crop was off to a really good start. Good development out in the fall, good emergence. It has probably been at least 3 years since we had such a good start to the season as we're seeing this year.
Romulo, you've talked about how we got to this point, so where are we now with the wheat crop?
That takes us to the weather that has been experienced throughout the rest of the season, which was the remaining of the fall and the winter as well, right? So overall, it was a fairly warm winter. We accumulated more growing degree days this year as compared to historical records, right? In fact, kind of throughout the state, at this point in time, which is early April, right, we have accumulated almost double the amount of growing degree days compared to historical records. And so, for example, the crop in the southeast part of the state, many years, year in, year out, at this point in time, we will expect the crop to be kind of getting to jointing stage of the development this time of the year. And honestly, this year, they are almost a flag leaf emergence already, right? So they are way ahead of schedule, at least a couple of weeks ahead of schedule. Kind of about the same, perhaps not as advanced in South Central, but again, we're definitely seeing in second node very clearly. And as we move forward north towards central part of the state, this time of the year, we wouldn't be expecting too much development of the crop, perhaps still during that tillering stage. And it has started to elongate, perhaps even reaching the first joint at this point, kind of in that Hoisington region or even north from there. And same thing, if we go to northwest Kansas, right, we'd expect the crop to be kind of just now getting out of tiller. And again, the crop is well ahead out there. So talking to growers all over the state, the estimate is that the crop is at least a couple of weeks ahead of schedule as compared to where it should be. And that has implications on first hollow stem as well. All of the varieties that we measure first hollow stem in the Hutchinson region are way past that. Actually, for at least a good 10 days or so, they have already reached that first hollow stem. So again, the crop is ahead of schedule. If there's any grazing ongoing, unless northwest Kansas, right, it probably should be terminated by this time, so we are not causing any further yield loss. But I guess more important, or perhaps for this year, right, what's on growers' minds more than the grazing itself, it really is any potential for freeze injury, right? Because the crop being further ahead, it also means that it is less tolerant to cold temperatures. So the winter wheat crop is going to be the most tolerant to cold temperatures during that late December into January, early February time frame. After that, as the temperatures start to warm up, it starts breaking dormancy, and it might still be well protected if the growing point is below ground. But again, we're talking about the growing point being well above ground in many parts of the state, right, at the first, second joint, or even getting to the flag leaf emergence. And the further from the ground the growing point is, the more sensitive to cold conditions the crop is as well. So usually, if it's in the middle of the winter and we're seeing, low teens or air temperatures in the low teens or even single digits, for the most part, if the crop had a good cold acclimation last fall, I'm not very concerned. However, as the crop gets going, it gets more and more susceptible, right, to cold temperatures. And so, for example, a crop at the jointing stage, typically we talk about the temperature threshold there of around 24 degrees, so kind of low 20s, right? We don't want to see temperatures too much lower than that. Otherwise, you can start seeing some freeze damage in the crop. And the further along it is, the more sensitive. So again, if it's getting to that flag leaf or boot stage, maybe 27, 28 degrees can already cause some damage. And so that's why this is kind of what's on growers' mind right now rather than the first hollow stem.
And what damage would growers be seeing to their wheat crop?
So the potential for freeze injury from those cold temperatures that we saw last week on March 26th and March 27th, it really is going to depend on a few different things, right? First, the growth stage of that crop, so how far along it is. Second, air temperatures, right? How cold did it get and for how long were those cold temperatures sustained? So the duration of the cold temperatures as well. Depending on the condition of the crop, soil temperatures can also help. The snow cover would also impact the extent of the freeze damage, right? So if we think of wheat growth stage around Kansas, again, it is ahead of schedule, right? We're probably a good 2 weeks perhaps ahead of schedule. So a lot of the states are already seeing jointing, which gets more sensitive to those cold temperatures, right? And when we think of the second factor that impacts our potential cold damage is how cold did it get? And for a lot of the states, we saw temperatures reaching low teens, right? We saw 10 and 11 in northwest Kansas fairly consistently there. Southwest Kansas, in parts of the state, we also saw as low as 11 or even 10. In the second day, on the March 27th, it got down to around 11 or so, as far north as Solomon, right? And so kind of the crop was pretty further along out there. And so these cold temperatures, they can definitely lead to some extent or to some damage, right, to the crop. Again, threshold for a crop that is around jointing, which is a lot of the crop, southwest Kansas through central Kansas, would be low 20s, and we got to low teens. So there is a good chance of damage there. I know that there was some snow that came down as well. If the snow was out there, the crop could have been buffered from those cold temperatures and more protected. But again, we were in some parts of the state as many as 11, 12, 13 hours below 24 degrees, right? And so that's long enough to cause some damage right now. The extent of the damage, again, is going to depend position on the landscape. Lower ground near like a river bottom or something is going to be more exposed to those cold temperatures. Soil moisture, right? Because more moist soil is going to buffer some temperatures in some temperature changes as well. And so if the growing point is close to the soil and the soil is moist, there is more hope that the damage might not have been as large as we kind of expect. But again, there are a few regions of the state, in particular parts of southwest Kansas, where the crop was well advanced, and it got quite cold out there, down to 10 or 11 for many hours, right? And parts of central Kansas as well, where the crop was also further along. And then in the second day of the cold spell, it also got to those 11 degrees or so, and it was held there for quite a few hours. We can see some damage to the crop.
How are producers able to go out and check their crops for damage?
Yeah, so we're all anxious to go out and take a look, right? I have been kind of holding back on that because, it's our first reaction. We want to go out and look for it. But really it takes a good week or 10 days until we start being able to see the damage to the growing point, right? Of course, the smell of silage, that odor is going to come out there just because the crop got burned back. So if you go out in the field right after that freeze, you're going to feel that smell of silage kind of coming up. There will be leaf damage as well, right? Now, what we're interested in at this point is whether there was damage to the developing head. And to check for that, we really need to split those stems upwards and look for the growing point, right? The closer to the soil it is, the more protected it is. But the further up into the stem, the more likely we are to see some damage, right? Now, if that growing point is nice and light green and turgid, right, that's a good sign that we probably haven't seen some damage at least yet. Now, if it's becoming mushy and kind of like whitish towards the brown, that can be a concern, right? It's probably indication that there was some freeze damage ongoing there. But again, I would still give some time, right? The freeze is now just barely a week away. I'll probably give a good 10 days, maybe even a couple of weeks, let it warm up a little bit, and then we're really going to see the extent of that damage. I think we will see some damage, especially more advanced fields, river bottom, kind of lower position on the landscape. I think we're going to have some damage. As long as the crown is still alive, the crop might still be able to produce steelers and still make up for some of those yield potential that was lost. But again, right now, there's nothing that we can truly do other than just wait and perhaps another week or so until we can make an informed decision about those fields.
Romulo, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and give us an update on how wheat is doing in Kansas.
Thank you, Shelby. It's always great to be here with you and sharing some of our thoughts with the growers out there. Thank you for the opportunity of having me here today.
Absolutely. That was K-State Wheat Production Specialist Romulo Lollato. In today's show notes on agtoday.net, I will link some articles from the Agronomy E-Update if you'd like to read more on this topic. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more ahead.
You're tuned into Agriculture Today. I'm Jacob Cloughton for Shelby Varner, and we end today's show with Brad White, Katie Long, and Brian Lubbers from the Beef Cattle Institute.
Katie Long is a graduate student. She's working on her master's. She has been here, and a lot of her work has been on heart disease, and she's talked about heart disease on the last couple times that she's been on here. But today we're going to talk about something different. And Katie, your research has kind of dived into bovine respiratory disease and looking at combination antimicrobial therapy. So that's a question that we've had from people saying, is it useful or is it not useful? So how did you start to address this problem? What are the techniques that you used?
Sure. So we performed a literature review to look at what data was available for treating BRD using combination therapy, if that was a more effective method versus solo monotherapy for antibiotics. There wasn't very much information out there.
Okay, so when you say not very much information, Brian, how many articles did you find relative to cattle?
So I think we started with just under 300 total, and we filtered through those, like were they actually BRD and were they studies that compared two antimicrobials to one of the two antimicrobials used in combination. And we applied, articles that were published in English. And by the time we got through all our study exclusion criteria, I think we ended up with 6 veterinary articles. Is that right?
Six veterinary articles. Yes. And then we did a human search just to see what else was out there. And there were 2 articles. So 8 total articles that specifically looked at what we asked about, comparing to a combination therapy to a monotherapy.
So the initial goal going in was we'll be able to find literature, and we've done this on other topics. You find a lot of literature, you can kind of summarize and say, okay, here's what we know about this. You have relatively few articles. Did they still give you an indication of, is this effective or not effective, or do we have enough to judge?
Most of the papers showed indifference in the use, and so it would be really helpful if there was some kind of clinical trial to see how effective that might be, and maybe even some surveys just to see how people are practicing using antimicrobials.
Yeah, and so, we talked about, there's 6 articles that we found in veterinary medicine. A lot of those studies were in vitro studies, which are nice when you want to look at combination therapy because it controls for a lot of factors. So we're just looking at the interaction between the antibiotics and the pathogen. But we found almost nothing on the clinical field study type design. And so, to go out and say, yeah, we've got this really strong evidence that says combination therapy works, or even combination therapy doesn't. We ended up where we can't really feel confident saying either way.
But the lab studies that you mentioned, they compare combinations to a pathogen, whereas in the field, which is what you'd like to have, we may have combinations compared to multiple pathogens, which we often see with respiratory disease.
Right. And that's kind of the predominant thought with using combination therapy is it broadens the spectrum, right? It gives us more coverage, even though it's true. Yeah. In the field, we're likely to see combinations of pathogens. Overall, the spectrum of coverage for the individual antimicrobials is very, very similar, right? So a lot of the combinations that you would think about using clinically, they don't open up the spectrum, like they don't add another pathogen specifically. And so, I think, we're kind of leaning to, at this point, there's not good evidence that says it's a useful practice. There's not evidence that says it doesn't work either. So I caveat a little bit, but there's just not much out there. And so to use it as routine practice is, I'm not ready to say, yeah, we can feel comfortable doing that.
And Katie, we talked about the animal side, but you didn't see anything on the human side that said yay or nay either, or not enough to judge? Not
enough to judge with that data either. There was just not very much out there to support or refute it. So.
Yeah, I appreciate you doing that because it's great to dig in, and we didn't think we would find very many, but we thought maybe we'd find a few more than we did because This is a common question. So nice job working through that, and it's been, I think, an important piece of information. We'll share further information in the e-blast this Friday that you'll have more details on this, and the publication should be coming out relatively soon.
That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.